The Flaxborough Flower Show had never promised much excitement. Nestled within a low-roofed pavilion at the heart of the village, it was a modest affair. Daisies, dahlias, and a few rather limp begonias were arranged with all the enthusiasm of a school sports day. The afternoon sun slanted through the rafters, dappling the rows of unimpressive displays, as local gossip swirled in the air, thick enough to scent the flowers themselves. A series of murmurs passed between the attendees, the usual crowd of housewives, in sensible shoes, retired soldiers, and men in ill-fitting suits who had long ago ceased to worry about being seen in them. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, as Mrs. Bovington, the mayor's wife, leaned forward with a particularly deep frown toward Mrs. Forrester, who was adjusting the chrysanthemums, something happened that no one had expected. At first, it seemed like little more than an odd interruption. A peculiar figure, dark-haired and wearing an ill-matching tweed jacket, had entered the pavilion with all the enthusiasm of a man who knew he shouldn't be there. He stood still at the entrance for a long moment, surveying the scene with an odd smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, as if preparing to deliver some grand pronouncement. But instead of making any such dramatic gesture, he simply strolled. No one recognized him, and his presence immediately became the subject of suspicion. "Well, who's this then?" Mrs. Bovington whispered sharply, tilting her head. "Looks like a bit of a scoundrel, doesn't he?" Mrs. Forrester, who never missed an opportunity to know something about someone else, cleared her throat. "I think he's the new man at Holloway's farm, Mr. Lawrence or something. You know, the widow's new tenant." At the mention of the widow, a ripple passed through the crowd. It was not so much a scandal as a series of small, careful whispers about the widow herself, who had been living at the farm ever since her late husband's untimely passing. People whispered that her late husband had been a cold man, but that didn't explain her more recent and curious social activities, including her fondness for early evening strolls along the lane that bordered the farm's boundary. The man moved, with unnerving ease between the displays, his fingers lightly grazing the flower petals, though never picking anything up. It was as if he were savoring the air, or perhaps searching for something. At least that was how it seemed to Mrs. Bovington, whose eyes never left him. "Excuse me," Mrs. Forrester said, nudging Mrs. Bovington with a sharp elbow. "That fellow over there, he's been eyeing the widow, hasn't he? I've seen him more than once at the farm, mind you, though I couldn't say what they were doing." Mrs. Bovington sniffed. "Such a thing can't go on unnoticed, Forrester. A man of that age and, how can I put it, his mannerisms. They do suggest something untoward, don't you think?" The conversation paused as the man strolled out of view, leaving behind only the faint scent of pipe tobacco, which had clung to the air like an unspoken promise. And for a moment it seemed nothing more would come of it. Then an hour later, when the last of the visitors had begun filtering out and the pavilion had emptied into the late afternoon, a figure hurried in, Mrs. Baines, the widow from Holloway's farm. Her appearance had been anticipated only by the flurry of whispers which had gone ahead of her. She was still dressed in the same pale yellow shawl that had begun to fray at the edges, and her hands, slightly trembling, clasped the empty basket she had brought with her. "I've had an accident," she announced to no one in particular, her voice soft but somehow strained. "A mishap at the farm. I don't know what's come over me." Her story spilled out in fragments, like a jigsaw puzzle one could not yet see the edges of. She spoke of a candle, a spill, a faint smell of something unusual from the kitchen. But it was what she left unsaid, her quick, darting glances, the manner of her speech, that caught the attention of Mrs. Forrester. She leaned in closer, for in that moment it became clear to the sharp-eyed listener that Mrs. Baines wasn't merely upset. She was afraid, but Mrs. Bovington was already heading toward the door, her lips pressed together as if she had just made up her mind about something. "The man," she muttered under her breath. "That man was seen last night, and now this." "How dare he?" "Who, Mrs. Bovington?" Mrs. Forrester asked quietly, though her eyes were fixed on the widow. "The new man from the farm," she replied, her voice rising in indignation. "It's not good, I can see it." By the time Inspector Purbright arrived in Flaxborough the next day, the usual hum of village life had resumed, though it was not without a perceptible undercurrent of tension. The flower show was already fading into memory, but the incident with Mrs. Baines had gained a peculiar life of its own. Rumours floated as thick as smoke, and the more the villagers talked, the less coherent the facts became. What exactly had happened at Holloway's farm? Had the widow been the victim of something or someone, perhaps a seduction in the flickering light of a candle? Inspector Purbright stood in the doorway of the small station, gazing out over the square with the patience of a man who had seen far worse events unfold with far more alarming results. He adjusted his hat and began walking toward the village hall where the first of many quiet inquiries would soon begin. There was no rush. Flaxborough had always been a place where things could be allowed to unfold at their own pace. But as Purbright passed the flower stall, the quiet hum of conversation on the breeze, the faint smell of chrysanthemums still lingering in the air, he had a feeling that this case, unremarkable on the surface, might prove far more complicated than anyone had yet realized. Purbright had always found the first impressions of a case to be the most useful, and today was no exception. The village hall was bustling with the usual morning routine, a few men lingering outside on benches, chatting over pipes, while the women darted in and out, balancing baskets of vegetables or parcels for the postman. A normal day, at least on the surface. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of freshly brewed tea, as the small council office hummed with the low murmur of bureaucratic conversation. Purbright had come not only to investigate, but to observe. His manner, quiet and unassuming, was well suited for this kind of task. He took his seat opposite Councillor Allen, a stout, middle-aged man with a thin, nervous moustache and a tendency to shuffle papers unnecessarily. Allen had been the one to send for Purbright, suggesting that the peculiar nature of Mrs. Baines's visit at the flower show might require an official investigation. There had been no outright accusation, but the tremor in her voice had caught the attention of more than one villager. "Now, Purbright," Allen began, fidgeting with a pencil, "we're not saying there's any trouble, mind you. Mrs. Baines has always been a good, respectable woman, but after that visit yesterday it does seem, well, a bit odd." Purbright leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the wooden armrest. He gave nothing away, keeping his features composed, but inside he was already calculating. A simple woman, a candle, a spill, and a visitor with an unclear purpose. That was what Mrs. Baines had described in the fragments of her story, and yet the unsaid parts had left an echo of something more. "Mrs. Baines didn't seem, how shall I put it, herself yesterday," Allen continued, his voice dropping. "I've known her for years, Purbright, and she's always been a bit of a mystery. She's not one to share much of her personal life, but there's something about the way she acted yesterday. Distressed, you might say, almost, well, frightened." "Did she mention anything about the man she claims to have seen?" Purbright asked, his tone polite though sharp in its subtle probing. Allen shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Not much. Just that she'd had an accident, and that the candle, well, it was all too much for her. But we both know, don't we, that accidents like that don't just happen. Not when a woman's alone, not at her age. And there's something else, Purbright. Have you heard the rumors about that fellow?" "Mr. Lawrence, the new tenant at Holloway's farm." Purbright's eyes flickered briefly, though his expression remained the same. The name had come up several times in hushed tones the previous day, and it seemed as though the man's arrival at the farm had ruffled more than just Mrs. Baines's quiet existence. People in the village were quick to talk, but slow to confirm. "Lawrence," Purbright said, letting the name roll off his tongue with deliberate casualness. "What exactly do you mean, Councillor? What rumors?" "Well, it's the usual nonsense, I suppose. No one says it outright, but there are whispers, you know. They say he's a charming sort of fellow, a bit too charming, some would say. The kind who knows how to make a woman feel special, perhaps a little too special." Purbright made no comment, simply waiting. Allen seemed eager to continue. "Mrs. Baines and her late husband? Well, that was a long, quiet marriage from what I've heard. Not much of a connection, but she stuck by him, didn't she? Now, with him gone, some people think she might be looking for a bit of excitement. The arrival of a man like Mr. Lawrence. Well, you get the picture." Purbright allowed the silence to settle between them for a moment, as he considered Allen's words. There were layers to the situation, some of them more obvious than others. Lawrence's charm, it seemed, was both a gift and a potential weapon, and the widow who had lived a life of quiet solitude was suddenly thrown into a world of possibilities that she might not have been prepared for. Or was she? Do you think she's involved with him? Purbright asked, keeping his voice level. Alan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, I'd be surprised if they weren't, Purbright, but I can't say for certain. Like I said, it's just whispers. But when a man like Lawrence comes to town, people notice. And when a woman like Mrs. Baines seems so rattled, it doesn't sit right with me. Purbright nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the desk in front of him. The pieces were starting to take shape, though the picture was still incomplete. Mrs. Baines's distress, Lawrence's charm, the suggestion of something more. It all pointed to something. What precisely, he wasn't sure yet. Have you spoken to Mrs. Baines about this, then? Purbright asked. I've spoken to her, yes, Alan replied, his voice more measured now. But she's not exactly forthcoming. She's closed off about it. Wouldn't let on if there was anything serious between her and Lawrence, that's for certain. But I've got a feeling, Purbright. You know how these things go. And in a small town like Flaxborough, people talk. They notice the little things. Can't they add them all up? Purbright rose from his chair, smoothing the crease in his coat. I'll have a word with Mrs. Baines, he said quietly. And I'll pay Mr. Lawrence a visit as well. For now, let's see what turns up. As he left the village hall, the town stretched out before him, unassuming in its sleepy charm. Flaxborough, on the surface, was a place where everything remained, steady, orderly. Yet beneath that surface, a small, curious mystery was beginning to unfurl. He walked down the street slowly, each step deliberate, letting the rhythm of the town seep into him. The flower show, Mrs. Baines, Mr. Lawrence. These were the first threads of a story that was only just beginning to weave itself together. It would be a quiet investigation, like all of Purbright's investigations. Nothing too dramatic. Nothing too hurried. But Purbright knew as he moved toward the farm at the edge of town that sometimes the most ordinary of places hid the most extraordinary of truths. And Flaxborough, with all its small-town charm and secrets, was about to reveal just that. The walk to Halloway's farm was a familiar one, though today Purbright's pace was slower than usual, his thoughts focused on the next step in this quiet puzzle. The day had turned overcast, and a thin drizzle began to fall, making the narrow lane between the town and the farm slick underfoot. The wind, cool and gusty, carried with it the faint scent of damp earth and the far-off murmur of distant sheep. Purbright's coat flapped loosely behind him, the heavy fabric muffling his steps as he made his way toward the end of the lane. As he approached the farmhouse, he noticed that the windows were tightly shut, an unusual thing for a farm in the middle of the day. The house had the look of a place that was kept in a state of careful order, too tidy for a working farm. But then the woman who lived there, Mrs. Baines, had always struck him as someone who valued control. It was a quality he had observed. In the brief moments they had crossed paths, when she had come to town to do her shopping or attend a local meeting, she was reserved, almost too much so, and Purbright couldn't help but wonder what she was hiding behind her calm exterior. When he reached the front door, Purbright hesitated for only a moment before lifting his hand and knocking. The sound was sharp and deliberate, breaking the stillness of the afternoon. A moment passed, then another, and the door creaked open slowly. Mrs. Baines stood in the doorway, looking slightly startled, as if she had been expecting someone, but not quite so soon. "Inspector Purbright," she said, her voice still warm despite the coolness in the air. "How can I help you?" "Good afternoon, Mrs. Baines," he said politely, offering a small nod. "I was hoping we could have a quiet word, if you don't mind. I'm investigating a small matter, and I thought it might be best to start here." She looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before stepping aside to let him enter. Her house was just as Purbright expected, well kept with an almost clinical neatness. The faint smell of lavender lingered in the air, and the low, constant hum of a fireplace crackling softly in the corner added an odd sense of warmth to an otherwise sterile atmosphere. "I trust I'm not disturbing you?" Purbright asked, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Not at all," Mrs. Baines replied. "Please come in. You'll have to excuse the state of things. I wasn't expecting any visitors today." Purbright took a seat at the small wooden table, observing the way she moved about the room with careful precision, straightening items on shelves, folding a piece of cloth, all with the deliberate movements of someone trying to keep their mind occupied. "I've come to ask you about something that happened at the flower show yesterday," he began, keeping his voice neutral. "I understand you had a bit of an accident while you were there." She stiffened slightly at the mention of the show, though her face remained unchanged. "Yes," she said after a brief pause. "There was a small mishap. A candle, a bit of wax. It's hardly worth mentioning, really." "Of course," Purbright said, nodding thoughtfully. "But I understand you seemed a bit distressed when you spoke about it. Is that true?" She hesitated, as though weighing her words carefully. "I suppose I was upset," she admitted finally. "I've never been one to make a scene, but something about the whole situation, well, it unsettled me, but it's nothing to concern yourself over, Inspector." Purbright studied her closely, noting the way her fingers tightened around the teacup she had just poured for him. She was good at hiding her emotions, but not perfect. There was something behind her words, something she wasn't saying. And that was what bothered him the most. He had learned long ago that when people were trying to conceal something, it was often the smallest of details that held the key. "I see," Purbright said, leaning back slightly in his chair. "And what about the man who was there, Mr. Lawrence, the new tenant at Halloway's farm? He's a familiar face around here, I understand." Her gaze flickered to the side just for a moment, but it was enough for Purbright to catch the shift. "Mr. Lawrence is a good man," she said slowly. "He's been kind enough to help me with a few things around the farm since his arrival, but that's all there is to it. He's just a tenant, Inspector, nothing more." There was a slight edge to her voice now, one that Purbright didn't miss. He had heard that same tone before in many different contexts, when someone was trying to deflect or hide the truth behind a wall of politeness. "Is that all?" he pressed, not wanting to let her off so easily. "You've been living here alone for some time now, Mrs. Baines. It must be quite a change having someone new around, especially someone like Mr. Lawrence." Her eyes hardened ever so slightly. "I'm not a fool, Inspector," she said sharply, her voice steady, but with an underlying current of irritation. "I know what you're implying, but I assure you there's nothing untoward going on here. Just a bit of help from a new neighbor, that's all." Purbright let the silence stretch. Between them, his gaze fixed on her. There was something more to this story, something that didn't quite add up. But he knew better than to push too hard. He could feel the wall that was rising between them, and he would need to take a different approach to get past it. "Of course," he said finally, offering a faint smile. "I'm sure there's nothing to it, but I do appreciate your cooperation, Mrs. Baines. I'll let you get back to your day." She nodded stiffly, though her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you, Inspector," she said quietly, the door already half open. As though eager to see him on his way, Purbright stood and replaced his hat, making his way back toward the door. As he stepped into the cool air outside, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. Mrs. Baines had been polite, even accommodating, but there was something more beneath the surface, something she wasn't willing to admit. Her discomfort with the mention of Lawrence, the hesitation in her voice and the subtle way her emotions had shifted, suggested that whatever was happening at Halloway's farm, it wasn't as simple as she wanted it to seem. And then, just as Purbright was about to leave, the faintest sound of movement caught his attention. He turned just in time to see a figure disappear around the corner of the farmhouse. Someone else had been watching their conversation. Purbright's eyes narrowed as he stood still for a moment, taking in the brief movement he'd seen near the corner of the house. The figure had been too quick to identify clearly, but it had been enough to rattle his growing sense of unease. Someone had been watching him and Mrs. Baines, though neither had acknowledged the presence of another person. He stood there in the damp air, weighing his next move. The figure was no longer in sight, but Purbright knew it was unlikely to be a coincidence. He turned slowly, his mind ticking over the details. The person had been careful, almost too careful, and that made Purbright more certain than ever that there was more to this case than a simple misunderstanding at the flower show. For a brief moment, he considered returning to Mrs. Baines and pressing her further. But he knew better than to rush things. It would only cause her to withdraw further into herself, and that was the last thing he wanted. She'd already shown signs of tension during their conversation, and another round of questions might close off any chance of learning something useful. Instead, Purbright decided to pursue the more straightforward path for now, a quiet visit to Mr. Lawrence. If he was the figure lurking around the edges of the story, it was time to see what he had to say. With a slow, deliberate step, he made his way around the back of the farmhouse, toward the stables where he assumed Lawrence might be working. The farm, though modest, was still a working property. The barn doors were slightly ajar, and Purbright could hear the soft murmur of animals inside. Nothing too unusual. The clink of metal on metal, the steady sound of someone moving hay. As he approached, he noticed that Lawrence was indeed present, but rather than in the barn as Purbright had expected, he was standing near the fence at the far end of the field, staring out over the gentle slope of the farmland. "Mr. Lawrence?" Purbright called out, his voice even but carrying enough to be heard. Lawrence turned slowly at the sound of his name, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips, though his eyes remained guarded. There was something unnerving about his calm demeanor, like a man who knew he was being watched but didn't mind it. "Inspector," Lawrence said, his voice smooth, with just a hint of an accent that Purbright couldn't quite place. "I wondered when you'd come round." Purbright gave a small, polite nod. "I was just speaking with Mrs. Baines, and I wanted to ask you a few questions as well." Lawrence's smile didn't fade, but it softened. "Of course, I had a feeling you'd be curious about the newcomer. Nothing to hide here, Inspector. Just getting on with my work. But please, what can I do for you?" Purbright studied him for a moment. There was an easy charm about Lawrence, the kind that could make people feel both comfortable and disarmed in his presence. But Purbright had learned to trust his instincts, and something about Lawrence's presence felt too smooth, too practiced. It was as if he was always ready with the right answer, never missing a beat. "I'm investigating the events at the flower show yesterday," Purbright began. "I understand you were present there, Mr. Lawrence. Mrs. Baines mentioned you." Lawrence nodded, though his eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the words. "Ah, yes. Mrs. Baines and I crossed paths, but I'm sure you know it was a rather innocuous encounter. A bit of small talk, nothing more to it. More to—" Purbright watched him closely, looking for any sign of hesitation, any shift in the man's carefully composed expression. "Nothing more, you say?" "Nothing at all," Lawrence replied smoothly. "I stopped by the flower show to stretch my legs, take in the sights. It's a rather pleasant event, I must say, very charming. But I was there no longer than a few minutes and certainly didn't make any impression." Purbright kept his tone even. "And you were aware that Mrs. Baines was there? Alone? A bit of an unfortunate incident from what I hear." "Yes, I heard about it, though I didn't see it myself. As I said, I didn't linger. Mrs. Baines is a respectable woman. I've no doubt it was simply an accident. People make mistakes. I'm sure that's all it was." Purbright let the words settle between them, then said quietly, "What do you know of her late husband, Mr. Lawrence?" Lawrence's eyes flickered just for a moment, but it was enough. "I didn't know him well," he said, his voice steady, but there was a touch of tension in his words now. "But I've heard he wasn't in the best of health before his passing. Terrible shame, that." "Yes, a shame," Purbright agreed, his gaze unwavering. "But sometimes, Mr. Lawrence, we find that what's behind someone's death is less than straightforward, don't we?" Lawrence's gaze sharpened, his smile slowly fading into something more neutral. "Inspector, if you're suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Purbright interrupted gently, his voice almost apologetic. "I'm simply trying to understand what happened. You're a tenant on her farm, and it's only natural that I'd want to ask you a few questions." There was a long pause, during which the two men regarded each other in silence. Lawrence's earlier composure had slipped, just enough for Purbright to catch the subtle shift, a tightening of the jaw, the briefest flash of uncertainty in his eyes. For a split second, he seemed almost defensive. But then, as quickly as it had come, the mask was back in place. "I can see you're a thorough man, Inspector," Lawrence said, his tone now colder. "But there's really no need to go looking for things that aren't there. I'm just here to do my work, as I said." Purbright said nothing, but the silence stretched, both men acutely aware of the tension that had entered the conversation. Finally, Purbright spoke again, his voice as calm as ever. "I'll be in touch, Mr. Lawrence. Perhaps we can have a more formal discussion later when it's convenient for you." He didn't wait for a reply, but turned to leave, his steps firm and measured. As he walked back toward the lane, the drizzle had begun to pick up, making the dirt path slick beneath his shoes. He could feel the weight of Lawrence's words hanging in the air, and the feeling that something was being hidden was only growing stronger. Lawrence had been too composed, too evasive. It was a typical defense, the kind used by men who had something to hide, though they were careful not to make it obvious. Purbright's mind turned over the details as he walked slowly back toward town. Mrs. Baines, her hesitations, and Lawrence with his easy charm and well-practiced answers. There was a connection there, something that didn't add up, but the pieces were still out of reach, and Purbright knew that in cases like this, rushing toward conclusions was the surest way to miss the truth. For now he would wait. The key, as always, would lie in the smallest of details, something overlooked, something forgotten, and sooner or later, he was confident, one of them would reveal itself. The next morning dawned cold and grey, a quiet reflection of the mood that had settled over Flaxborough since Purbright's visit to Halloway's farm. The air was thick with the damp of early autumn, the sky a blanket of soft clouds that seemed to press down on the town. The streets, normally busy with the murmur of town gossip and foot traffic, felt almost empty, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Purbright's thoughts were on the conversation he had had with Mr. Lawrence the previous day. He had been careful, perhaps too careful. There had been no outright lies, no grand gestures of guilt. But Purbright had felt it, the subtle tightness, the stiffness in Lawrence's posture, the fleeting look in his eyes when certain topics were mentioned. There was something about the man that didn't sit right, but Purbright knew from experience that hunches were not enough to make accusations. He would need more, something concrete, something that would tie it all together. He had spent the morning revisiting the facts, considering every detail with the sort of meticulous patience that was his trademark. Mrs. Baines had been alone at the flower show, but the way she had looked at him when they spoke, it had been more than just the distress of a simple accident. There had been fear in her eyes, the kind that wasn't easily faked. Still, it was too early to draw conclusions. And so, after a quick breakfast, Purbright decided to pay another visit to the widow. There was something else he needed to ask her, something small but important, a question that might reveal just a little more of the puzzle. By the time he reached Halloway's farm again, the rain had started to fall more steadily, making the dirt path squelch underfoot. He walked the familiar lane with deliberate steps, each one pulling him further into the quiet tension of the investigation. The farmhouse was still as neat as ever, its windows shut tight, though he could see a faint movement inside, a shadow that suggested someone was home. Purbright knocked firmly on the door, but this time there was no immediate response. A minute passed and then another before Mrs. Baines appeared at the door. She looked even more tired than the day before, her face pale, her hair slightly disheveled as if she hadn't bothered with it this morning. She seemed surprised but not alarmed by his presence. "Good morning, Mrs. Baines," Purbright said, giving her a polite smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I was hoping we could talk for a moment." She hesitated, then nodded and stepped back, allowing him to enter. There was an air of reluctance about her, but she didn't say anything as she led him into the sitting room. The small fire that had been crackling the day before was now reduced to smouldering embers, casting a dim light over the room. The same lavender scent hung in the air, but it seemed heavier now, as if it was trying to cover something else, something that didn't belong. Purbright settled into the chair he had occupied the day before, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He was careful not to seem too eager, too intrusive. He knew well that pressing too hard would only make people close off, and he needed Mrs. Baines to feel as though she was in control, despite the fact that he was the one asking the questions. "I wanted to ask you something, Mrs. Baines," he began, his tone soft but steady. "I understand you've been through a lot recently, and I don't want to trouble you unnecessarily. But I was wondering, have you noticed anything unusual around here? Anything at all that seemed out of place?" She looked at him, the wariness in her eyes deepening. For a moment she said nothing. The silence stretched between them, and Purbright could almost hear her weighing her options, trying to decide just how much to reveal. Finally she spoke, her voice low and almost reluctant. "Unusual," she repeated, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean by that?" "Anything. Anything that might seem off, Purbright said, choosing his words carefully. A person you didn't recognize, an event that seemed strange, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. I know it's difficult, but sometimes the smallest details can help. Mrs. Baines's eyes flickered briefly to the window, as if considering the storm outside, before she looked back at him. I don't know what you mean, Inspector, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. Everything here is just as it's always been. I live a quiet life. I have no reason to think anything is wrong. Purbright leaned forward slightly, sensing that there was more to be said. And what about Mr. Lawrence? He asked. You've known him for some time now. Has he ever said anything that struck you as strange, or perhaps behaved in a way that made you uncomfortable? At the mention of Lawrence's name, her face tightened for a brief moment, though she quickly masked it with a polite smile. Mr. Lawrence is a gentleman, she said, her tone a little too firm. He's only ever been kind to me. There's nothing strange about him, Inspector. Nothing at all. Purbright studied her closely, noting the way she seemed to cling to the last few words, almost as if she were trying to convince herself as much as him. There was something about the way she avoided his gaze just then, something almost defensive in her posture. But before he could press further, the sound of footsteps approached from the hallway. The door opened, and Lawrence stepped into the room, his presence sudden and commanding, though his demeanor remained calm. His sharp eyes flickered over Purbright before settling on Mrs. Baines, who looked startled by his unexpected arrival. Everything all right in here? Lawrence asked, his voice smooth and carefully modulated, as if he had every right to be there. I didn't expect to find you entertaining visitors, Mrs. Baines. Purbright glanced between them, noting the tension in the room that had shifted, now palpable in the air between them. Lawrence's gaze flicked to Purbright again, a trace of irritation barely hidden in his smile. I was just leaving, Purbright said, standing slowly. But I'll be back shortly. There are still a few things I need to ask. Lawrence's smile didn't change, though his eyes narrowed just slightly. Of course, Inspector. Whenever you like. As Purbright stepped back into the rain-soaked path outside, he felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Lawrence's timely arrival had been no accident. It was as if he had been watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to insert himself into the conversation. The calm facade he wore now, the careful politeness, it all felt like a performance, and Purbright had seen enough performances to know when someone was acting. There was something hidden here, and it wasn't just between Mrs. Baines and Lawrence. It was deeper, more tangled than he had expected. The pieces were all in place, but they hadn't yet come together. As he made his way back toward the village, the rain came down harder, but Purbright's mind was already racing ahead. The key, he knew, was not just in the words people said, but in what they weren't saying. And it was only a matter of time before those silences would reveal everything. The rain had settled into a steady downpour by the time Purbright returned to the village. The roads were slick with water, and the streets glistened under the dim glow of streetlights, casting reflections that rippled with every passing car. It was one of those afternoons where the world seemed to press in on itself, the grey clouds hanging heavy overhead, as if the weather itself had adopted the same mood as the town. Purbright's thoughts were focused on the visit to Halloway's farm and his brief conversation with Mrs. Baines and Mr. Lawrence. There was a growing sense of unease, the kind that clung to the edges of a case when the pieces started to fit, but still didn't quite align. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, his gut feeling that something wasn't right, and right now that feeling was stronger than ever. He made his way to the station, where he had arranged to meet with Constable Hollis, the young officer, who had been handling some of the background work for the case. Hollis was a capable enough man, eager to prove himself, but still a little too green to be trusted with the finer points of an investigation. Purbright had no illusions about him. He was competent, but his enthusiasm could sometimes cloud his judgment. Hollis was sitting at a small desk, flipping through a stack of papers when Purbright entered. He looked up, his face lighting up with the eager energy of someone who thought they had news to share. "Afternoon, sir," Hollis greeted him, standing up. "I've got something for you. A bit of a breakthrough, if you ask me." Purbright raised, an eyebrow leaning against the doorframe. "Go on," he said, his voice calm but curious. Hollis dropped the papers onto the desk, pointing to a particular page. "It's about Lawrence. Mr. Lawrence from Halloway's farm. I did a bit of digging into his background. Turns out he's got a history of, well, trouble. Nothing major, but a few things that seem interesting. Purbright moved closer. His interest piqued. He had suspected there was more to Lawrence than met the eye, but hearing it confirmed from another source gave the feeling of something solid beneath the murk. Hollis continued, tapping the page with a finger. He was in and out of a few minor scrapes in his younger days, Hollis said, his voice slightly conspiratorial. Petty theft, some issues with gambling, a few reports from places he used to live. But nothing that ever went to trial, nothing that ever stuck. Just a lot of things that don't sit right, if you know what I mean. Purbright studied the papers, his gaze lingering on the details. Lawrence had been a bit of a drifter, it seemed, moving from place to place, always managing to slip through the cracks of the law. It wasn't enough to be definitive, but it added weight to Purbright's suspicions. Is there more? Purbright asked, looking up from the page. Hollis nodded, his expression eager. Yes, sir. There's something else. The address he used for his last residence before he came to Flaxborough. It's in a rather rough part of town. And the name of the woman he was living with before he came here, well, that name rings a bell. Purbright's eyes narrowed. What's her name? Hollis hesitated, then tapped the page again. Her name's Sylvia Green, and I did a bit more digging. She's connected to some unsavory people with known criminal connections. Small time, but enough to make a person take notice. Purbright let out a quiet breath, processing the information. This was more than just a charming new tenant. Lawrence's past, his connections, and his sudden appearance in Flaxborough were starting to form a picture that looked less and less like mere coincidence. I want to know everything you can about this Sylvia Green, Purbright said, straightening up, and I want you to go to Halloway's farm and talk to anyone who might have seen Lawrence before he moved in. Get as much information as you can. Anything out of the ordinary. Hollis nodded, his eyes wide with the thrill of the task. Right away, sir. Purbright turned to leave, but stopped at the door, his hand resting on the frame. And Hollis, he said, his voice soft but commanding, stay quiet about this. No one else in town needs to know what we're looking into just yet. It'll only make things more complicated. Hollis gave a quick nod, the seriousness of the situation sinking in. Understood, sir. Purbright stepped out into the rain, his thoughts swirling around the new information. The case had shifted again, but this time the shift felt like a break. Sylvia Green. A name that was familiar in the way that all names were familiar in a small town. Everyone had heard of someone, or someone had heard of them, but this one felt different. The connections, the past. It all pointed to something far darker than a simple widow's distress. He walked toward the local pub, hoping to gather some more insight from the regulars. The pub was always a good place to start. People talked. Without realizing it, and in a small town like Flaxborough, the pub was often the pulse of local gossip. If he could get there before the evening crowd grew too large, perhaps he could hear something that hadn't yet made it into the public sphere. The heavy wooden door creaked open as he stepped inside. The low hum of conversation stopped for a split second as the locals glanced up, but then the murmur resumed. Purbright didn't pay it any mind. He was used to the subtle stirrings that followed his entrance. He was a familiar face in Flaxborough, and though his presence was often met with curiosity, it was never a surprise. He spotted old Joe at the bar, a man who had been living in Flaxborough longer than anyone cared to remember. His wrinkled face and perpetually furrowed brow made him seem like the kind of person who had seen a lot and knew even more. He was always a good place to start when looking for the quieter stories, the ones no one else dared to talk about. "Afternoon, Joe," Purbright said, stepping up to the bar. "Mind if I join you for a drink?" Joe looked up, his tired eyes assessing the inspector before he gave a slow nod. "Sure, Purbright. Have a seat. No rush around here." Purbright sat down, signaling for a drink. As Joe poured a pint, Purbright let the silence settle for a moment before speaking. "I'm sure you've heard about the new man at Halloway's farm," he said casually, leaning on the counter. Joe gave a nonchalant shrug. "Heard a few things," he said slowly. "Nothing good, nothing bad. A bit too smooth for my taste, though. Folks round here don't trust smooth talkers. You know how it is. Purbright sipped his drink, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. Anything particular about him that stands out? Joe's eyes flickered with the slightest trace of something darker, something Purbright had seen before in people who had learned to bury their real thoughts deep inside. Just a feeling, Joe muttered, leaning in closer. Came to town a bit too quickly, if you ask me. No one knew a thing about him, and then all of a sudden he's renting out that place. And don't forget Mrs. Baines. She's not the type to let anyone into her life, but, well, you know what they say about widows and new tenants. He paused, then added, sometimes the quiet ones have the most to hide. Purbright set his glass down slowly, his mind racing. Everything was beginning to fit together in ways that didn't feel quite right. Joe's words weren't just idle gossip, they were warning signs. And warnings, Purbright knew, were never to be ignored. Purbright finished his pint in silence, his mind turning over Joe's cryptic words. The idea of a smooth-talking newcomer coming to town, settling into a quiet village with no history, no past, seemed all too familiar. Lawrence's arrival had raised flags from the start, but now in the dim light of the pub and in the context of the whispers from the regulars, it felt more like a revelation. There was more to this than simply a lonely widow and a charming tenant. Joe was still leaning against the counter, wiping down a glass with a rag, though his eyes never left Purbright's face. He seemed to be waiting for the inspector's next move, but Purbright, in his usual way, was patient. He knew Joe wouldn't offer more unless he was prodded just right. I think I'll need to pay another visit to Mrs. Baines, Purbright said after a moment, his voice casual but with an edge of finality. You know anything about her family? Or maybe anyone who's been close to her in recent years? Joe's hand paused on the glass, the rag held still in midair. Family? Well, she's got a niece or something. I don't know much about her, but I've heard a thing or two. Last time she came to visit, I reckon it was to check on things, around here. Mrs. Baines doesn't exactly make a habit of company, but that girl, she's a bit like her aunt in some ways, quiet and hard to get a word out of. Where is she now? Purbright asked, leaning in slightly. This niece. Do you know where she lives? Joe gave a thoughtful grunt, setting down the glass and wiping his hands. No idea, haven't seen her for a while, but I know she was from around these parts. Comes and goes, probably lives further south now. Don't ask me why she's not around. More often, though. There's always something funny going on with that side of the family. Purbright nodded, digesting the information. He was beginning to realize that the more he dug into the people around Mrs. Baines, the more layers appeared, each one revealing just a little more of what was hidden beneath the surface. The widow's past, her family, Lawrence's unexplained arrival, it all seemed tangled in ways that he couldn't yet fully understand. Finishing his drink, Purbright stood up, placing the empty glass back on the bar. I'll let you know if I need anything else, Joe. I appreciate the help. Joe gave him a short nod, his expression unreadable now. Any time, Purbright. Just make sure you stay clear of trouble. Purbright wasn't sure if Joe was giving him advice or a warning, but either way it felt like the kind of thing he should pay attention to. With that thought in mind, he stepped out into the rain once again. The streets were emptier now, the late afternoon gloom settling in. He made his way back toward Holloway's farm, the wet road reflecting the dull light of the street lamps, like silver veins running through the town. When he arrived, he noticed something that hadn't caught his attention before. The barn doors were open, just a crack, but enough to see through. He approached quietly, slipping into the shadow of the barn to get a better look. There was no sign of movement, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. After a moment, the door creaked again, and Lawrence appeared, stepping out onto the dirt path that led to the house. Purbright froze, stepping further into the shadow, hoping to remain unseen. Lawrence stood still for a moment, gazing out at the distance, his posture relaxed but watchful. Then he turned and disappeared into the barn. It was subtle, but Purbright noticed it, the way Lawrence had glanced around before heading inside, as though he was checking to make sure no one had seen him. That small detail, an almost instinctive act, spoke volumes. Purbright waited for a few moments, making sure the coast was clear before approaching the barn. He moved with purpose, but without haste, slipping inside the dimly lit space. The musty smell of hay and wood filled his nostrils as he stepped deeper. scanning the area for any sign of unusual activity. It was just a barn, after all, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet there was something about the way it felt, too tidy, too maintained for a working farm. He noticed something near the far corner, just inside a small storage area that seemed to be used for tools. A stack of old crates was partially hidden, behind a tarp. He hadn't seen it before, not on his first visit, but it was here now, standing out just enough to raise suspicion. Purbright moved closer, his instincts telling him to investigate. There was a slight sound as he shifted the tarp, revealing the crates in full. His heart skipped a beat when he saw what was on top of one of them, a piece of broken ceramic. The kind of thing one would use for a garden pot, but this one was stained with what looked like dried blood. It was small, too small to be a major clue, but it was enough to confirm his suspicions that Lawrence had been hiding something in the barn, something he didn't want anyone to see. Purbright took a step back, his mind racing. This was no ordinary crime, no simple misunderstanding at the flower show. Lawrence was hiding something, and it seemed like it was all tied up with the widow, with Holloway's farm, and with the strange air of secrecy that had descended on Flaxborough. Before he could take another step, a voice broke the silence. "Inspector." Purbright froze. He hadn't heard the footsteps, hadn't sensed anyone approaching. He turned slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the inside pocket of his coat where he kept his notebook. It wasn't Lawrence who had spoken, though. It was Mrs. Baines. She stood at the barn entrance, her face pale but composed, as if she had known exactly where to find him. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly, her voice steady but with a hint of something else behind it, something like fear or perhaps resignation. Purbright studied her carefully, his mind spinning with new possibilities. Her sudden appearance wasn't a coincidence. She had seen him here, or perhaps she had been watching from the window of the house. "I was looking for you, Mrs. Baines," Purbright said, keeping his voice calm. "I think we need to have another conversation." Mrs. Baines stood there in the doorway, her face pale under the dim light of the barn. Her posture was tense, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, as if she were holding herself together, though Purbright could see the flicker of something, fear perhaps, behind her composed exterior. He'd come here expecting to find answers, but instead it seemed he was walking into a confrontation he hadn't quite anticipated. "I was looking for you, Mrs. Baines," Purbright repeated softly, taking a measured step forward. His voice was calm, though the silence between them felt heavy, laden with unspoken tension. "There's something we need to talk about. I think it's time to clear the air." She didn't move, her eyes scanning him briefly before drifting down to the floor, as if searching for something to anchor herself. Then, without looking back up, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, none of it." Purbright felt a shift in the atmosphere. The words she spoke weren't just about the events of the flower show or the broken pot in the barn. They were more, much more. Something deeper, something tied to the woman standing in front of him. "You don't have to explain yourself now," Purbright said, his tone gentle but firm. He took another step closer, keeping his voice steady. "But I need you to understand that there's no turning back from this. I know something's been hidden here, something about Mr. Lawrence, something about you, and I can't keep pretending I don't see it." For a long moment, Mrs. Baines said nothing. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, her fingers twitching as if struggling to find the words to speak. Finally, she raised her eyes to meet his, and in them, Purbright saw a deep, quiet sadness, a burden she had carried far too long. "I never wanted anyone to know about my past," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "And when Lawrence came, when he offered to help, I thought it would be all right. I thought I could move on from everything. But it's never that simple, is it? The past always catches up with you." Purbright's gaze softened, but he didn't speak. She needed to get this out, and he knew that pressuring her would only make things worse. "My husband, he was never the man people thought he was," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "People thought he was distant, cold, and maybe he was. But there were things about him that I kept hidden. I thought if I buried them deep enough, no one would ever find out. But Lawrence, he found out. And now, I don't know what he wants from me. Purbright didn't move, letting her words settle between them. There was a story here, a deeper story than he had first imagined. Lawrence's connection to Mrs. Baines was not just that of a helpful neighbor. There was more, and it was clearly tied to something painful, something unresolved. "Tell me about Lawrence," Purbright urged gently, his voice low. "What does he have on you? What does he want?" Mrs. Baines swallowed hard, her eyes welling with unshed tears, but she blinked them away, regaining her composure. "He knows about my first husband, the one before. Before the man everyone thought I was married to. He knows what happened to him. He knows everything." Purbright felt a chill run down his spine. He'd suspected as much. The story she was telling him, the way she spoke of Lawrence's knowledge, it pointed to something far darker than a simple flirtation or a manipulative tenant. "He's been blackmailing you, hasn't he?" Purbright's voice was steady, but his mind was working quickly, piecing together the fragments of her confession. "That's why you've been so afraid, why you've been so careful." Mrs. Baines nodded, her lips trembling. "Yes, he told me he would expose everything. The truth about my first husband, about what happened to him. He said I could either pay him off or he'd tell the whole town. He knew I couldn't risk that, not after everything I've built here. The lies I've had to tell, the secrets I've kept." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Purbright asked, though he already knew the answer. Fear had a way of silencing people, especially when they had so much to lose. "I was scared," she said simply, her voice breaking. "And I was ashamed. I never thought it would come to this. I never thought he would get so bold." Purbright took a deep breath, his mind racing. Mrs. Baines's fear, Lawrence's threats, they all pointed to something far bigger than a quiet village dispute. But the more Purbright listened, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about blackmail. It was about a dark history, buried so deep that even Mrs. Baines had thought she could keep it hidden forever. "What happened to your first husband, Mrs. Baines?" he asked quietly, his voice gentle yet firm. She met his gaze, her eyes haunted. "He died," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But not how everyone thought. Not the way it was reported. It wasn't an accident. And it wasn't a natural death." Purbright's heart raced. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they weren't forming the picture he had hoped for. This was no longer just a case of a lonely widow and a scheming tenant. There was murder in the past, a hidden death, and Lawrence was tied to it. He had to be. "I think it's time we go over to the station," Purbright said finally, his voice decisive. "There's more to this than just your fear of Lawrence. He's not just blackmailing you, is he? He's been using that knowledge to control you, and he's been manipulating everything." Mrs. Baines nodded, her face pale, but her eyes were clear now. There was no turning back. "I never wanted it to come to this, Inspector, but I knew it was only a matter of time before someone found out." Purbright placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a quiet reassurance. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Mrs. Baines, but you need to trust me now. We need to take everything you've told me to the proper authorities." She nodded once more, but her expression was distant, her mind already caught in the web of secrets she had tried so desperately to keep buried. As they stepped outside, the rain had lightened, though the clouds hung heavily overhead. The small town of Flaxborough was quiet once more, the same as it had always been, but Purbright knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Not after the truth had been exposed. The town's secrets had begun to unravel, and the truth, like a long-forgotten shadow, was finally beginning to surface. The walk to the station felt longer than usual, the quiet weight of Mrs. Baines's words pressing down on Purbright. He had asked the right questions, but even so, he wasn't sure he had all the answers yet. There was still something elusive about Lawrence, something unsettling in the way he had slid into the widow's life like a shadow, seemingly harmless, but hiding darker intentions beneath the surface. And as Purbright glanced at Mrs. Baines, walking beside him, he could see that the quiet relief in her eyes was only the calm before the storm. She was in deeper than she had let on, and the burden of her secrets had yet to fully lift. Purbright had always known that Flaxborough was a town with its share of stories, but this was different. People here weren't supposed to have. the kinds of histories that could unravel so easily. And yet, as he walked alongside Mrs. Baines, he knew that everything was about to come crashing down. It wasn't just about a widow and her tenant anymore. This was about a woman trapped in a web of lies, a murder long buried, and a man who knew far too much for comfort. As they reached the small police station, the weather had shifted again. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick with the smell of wet earth. The dampness clung to everything: Purbright's coat, his boots, the edges of his hair. He pushed open the door to the station, the familiar scent of paperwork and chalk dust greeting him as he stepped inside. Constable Hollis looked up from his desk, his brow furrowing slightly, as he noticed the grim expressions on both Purbright's and Mrs. Baines's faces. "Everything all right, sir?" Hollis asked, standing up and straightening his uniform. Purbright gave a brief nod but didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured for Mrs. Baines to sit. "We need to talk, Hollis. I think we've reached a point where things need to be set in motion." Hollis exchanged a glance with Mrs. Baines, then nodded slowly. "Right, sir. What's going on?" Purbright took a moment to organize his thoughts, but he could feel the urgency building. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together, but they painted a picture much darker than anyone had anticipated. "Mrs. Baines has been hiding something," Purbright said, his voice calm but firm. "Something serious, and it involves the man renting Halloway's farm, Mr. Lawrence." Hollis raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Lawrence? You think he's involved in something more than just being a tenant?" "Yes," Purbright said. "He's not just a neighbor. Lawrence has been blackmailing Mrs. Baines, using her past against her. But there's more to it than that. The past he's holding over her head goes back to the death of her first husband. It wasn't an accident, and Lawrence knows the truth." Mrs. Baines shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Purbright's gaze remained steady, his attention fixed on Hollis. "Lawrence has been using that knowledge to manipulate her, to control her. And if we don't act soon, it's only a matter of time before he tries something more drastic." Hollis absorbed the information, his brow furrowing as he processed the gravity of what Purbright was saying. "So what now, sir?" Purbright took a deep breath, his thoughts racing. There was no time to waste. Lawrence was too dangerous to be left unchecked, and the truth about Mrs. Baines's first husband needed to come to light before Lawrence could do any more damage. "I want you to gather everything we have on Lawrence," Purbright said, his voice sharp. "His background, his connections, anything that might give us leverage over him. I'm going to pay him a visit. We need to catch him off guard, find out exactly what he's planning." Mrs. Baines looked up, her face pale but resolute. "I'll come with you," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I have to face him. I can't keep hiding from this." Purbright hesitated for a moment, then nodded. It was clear that she was ready to confront the past, to finally put an end to the charade Lawrence had created. "All right," he said, his tone softening slightly. "We'll do this together. But we need to be careful. Lawrence will be watching, and we need to make sure we have the upper hand." The decision was made. As they left the station, the weight of the moment settled on Purbright's shoulders. This wasn't just about uncovering a long-buried secret. It was about bringing justice to a man who had manipulated his way into someone else's life, someone's tragedy, and was using it as his own weapon. The drive to Halloway's farm was uneventful, but Purbright could feel the tension growing in the air between them. Mrs. Baines had been quiet since they left the station, lost in her thoughts. She was about to face Lawrence, the man who had made her life a prison, and Purbright couldn't help but wonder what kind of confrontation awaited them. He knew she had to face him, but he also knew the danger that came with facing someone like Lawrence, someone who had no qualms about using people for his own gain. As they pulled into the farm, Purbright saw Lawrence standing in the yard, his posture relaxed as always. He looked up as they approached, his eyes flickering briefly to Mrs. Baines before settling on Purbright. There was no hint of surprise in his expression, just the same careful composure he always wore. "Inspector," Lawrence said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I didn't expect a visit today. What brings you by?" Purbright stepped out of the car, his gaze steady as he faced the man. "We need to talk, Mr. Lawrence," he said quietly. It's about Mrs. Baines and the past you've been hiding. Lawrence's eyes narrowed just slightly, but his smile didn't falter. The past, you say? There's not much to it, I'm afraid. I'm just a man trying to live quietly. And if Mrs. Baines has concerns, I'm sure we can work something out. Purbright didn't flinch. I don't think there's anything left to work out, Mr. Lawrence. It's time for the truth to come out. Mrs. Baines took a deep breath, stepping forward to stand beside Purbright. The look on her face was one of quiet determination. It's over, Lawrence, she said, her voice firm. I'm not afraid of you anymore. For a moment, Lawrence's eyes flickered, the briefest trace of something darker passing over his features. Then, just as quickly, he masked it with a smile. I think you'll find that the truth isn't always as simple as you think. Purbright's heart rate quickened. Lawrence was playing a dangerous game, but Purbright knew that this was the moment. Everything depended on it, on staying one step ahead of him, on forcing him to reveal whatever it was he had been hiding all along. We'll see about that, Purbright said, his voice calm but unwavering. But we'll be getting the truth, whether you like it or not. As he stepped closer, he could feel the tension between them growing thicker, heavier. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. And for the first time in a long while, Purbright felt the steady certainty of the law guiding him, ready to bring this mystery to its conclusion. The game was up. The silence between Purbright and Lawrence was thick with unspoken tension. Mrs. Baines stood slightly behind Purbright, her expression guarded but resolute, as if the act of facing Lawrence head-on had already begun to dismantle some of the weight that had burdened her for so long. Lawrence, for his part, maintained his usual calm composure, but there was something about his posture now, something stiff in the way he held himself that hinted at something more beneath the surface. "Inspector," Lawrence began, his voice cool, but edged with something that was hard to place. "I don't know what you think you've uncovered, but I assure you there's no need for any more drama. I've been nothing but respectful to Mrs. Baines. What you're suggesting is utterly out of line." Purbright kept his gaze fixed on him, taking in the way Lawrence's eyes darted momentarily to the side before quickly returning to meet his. It was subtle, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it told Purbright all he needed to know. Lawrence was lying. "It's not about respect, Mr. Lawrence," Purbright replied, his voice steady and controlled. "It's about the truth, and I think you've been hiding that truth for far too long. Mrs. Baines has made it clear that she's tired of being controlled by your threats." Lawrence's lips twitched, a fleeting expression that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so tight, so forced. "Threats? I don't make threats, Inspector. I simply offer opportunities for those who wish to make the most of their situation. And Mrs. Baines, well, she's always had the chance to walk away. She just hasn't." Mrs. Baines flinched slightly at his words, but Purbright placed a hand on her shoulder in quiet reassurance, keeping his focus on Lawrence. "I'm afraid the opportunity you speak of isn't as innocent as you'd like to pretend. You've been using Mrs. Baines's past against her, Mr. Lawrence. You've been manipulating her for far too long, and I'm here to make sure that stops." There was a long pause, and Purbright could see Lawrence's expression harden. The man was no longer hiding his frustration, though he still tried to mask it behind a veneer of civility. "Is that what you think?" Lawrence said, his voice lower now, a hint of something dangerous creeping into his words. "You think you've figured it all out? That you know everything about me and my dealings? You think she's the only one who has secrets to hide?" Purbright stepped closer, his presence calm but unwavering. "I don't know everything, Mr. Lawrence," he said, his voice just above a whisper. "But I know enough to see through the facade you've carefully built, and it won't hold up much longer." For a moment Lawrence said nothing, his lips pressed together tightly, his eyes narrowing as if calculating his next move. But then, with a sudden, almost imperceptible shift in posture, he seemed to decide on something. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Purbright," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think this is just about a few lies, a little blackmail? You have no clue what's really been going on here." Purbright didn't flinch. "Then enlighten me," he said, his voice quiet but forceful. "What exactly is going on here, Mr. Lawrence?" Lawrence let out a small, bitter laugh, almost to himself, before finally looking directly at Purbright. There was no more pretense now, no more polite smiles. This was the real Lawrence, the one who had been pulling strings in the shadows, the one who had been keeping secrets far darker than Purbright could have imagined. "You really want to know?" Lawrence asked, his tone cold, the mask completely gone. "Fine. You want the truth? Here it is. Mrs. Baines's first husband didn't just die by accident, and I know exactly how and why he died. But it wasn't me who killed him, it was her." Purbright froze. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a brief moment, his mind spun, trying to make sense of what Lawrence had just said. "You're lying," Purbright said, though his voice lacked the certainty he had once felt. "Mrs. Baines didn't kill anyone." Lawrence's lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. "I don't lie, Inspector. I deal in facts. Mrs. Baines's first husband was a problem. A man who knew too much, a man who threatened to ruin everything she had built. And when she realized there was no way out, she took matters into her own hands." Purbright's mind raced, but he kept his face neutral. "And you, what? You just happened to be there? You found out about it and decided to blackmail her for the rest of her life?" Lawrence didn't answer right away. He took a step forward, his gaze locking with Purbright's. "I didn't decide anything, Inspector. I simply found out the truth, and I made a deal. A deal with Mrs. Baines to keep her secret safe in exchange for a little cooperation. But things change, don't they? People get greedy, people make mistakes, and when someone like me finds out how far they're willing to go to keep their lies intact..." He let the words trail off, a sharp gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. Purbright stepped back, processing. The revelation, though, part of him still couldn't believe it. He turned to Mrs. Baines, who had gone pale at Lawrence's confession, her body trembling slightly. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, her hands wringing in the hem of her coat. "Is it true?" Purbright asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Did you really—" Mrs. Baines took a deep breath, her gaze lifting to meet his. The silence between them stretched long and taut before she spoke, her voice steady but laced with regret. "It's true," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I never wanted to do it. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But when George threatened to destroy everything I had, everything I had worked for, I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could hide it, keep it buried forever. And for a while, it seemed like I had. But then Lawrence came along, and everything started falling apart." Purbright could see the pain in her eyes, the guilt that had been eating away at her for years. But he also saw something else, a sense of relief. She had confessed finally, and now it was out in the open. "Mrs. Baines," Purbright said softly, "you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. We'll figure this out, together." For the first time since he had arrived at Holloway's farm, Mrs. Baines allowed herself to cry, her body shaking with the release of years of fear and shame. Purbright stood beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder, though he didn't look away from Lawrence. Lawrence stood there, silent for a moment, as if contemplating his next move. The smugness that had once filled him had begun to fade, replaced by something darker, something desperate. He knew that the game was over, and now Purbright was ready to finish it. "We'll take it from here, Mr. Lawrence," Purbright said, his voice cold, as his mind shifted back into the sharp, methodical rhythm of the investigation. "You're not going to control anyone anymore." As the words settled in the air, Lawrence didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the barn, his shoulders tense, as if accepting the inevitable. The truth had come out, and for the first time in a long time, Purbright felt the weight of it lift, the burden of the case finally falling into place. This was only the beginning of the end, and Purbright knew that now, justice would finally take its course. The rain had returned in full force, heavier now, as if the sky itself was mourning the unraveling of all that had been hidden for so long. The tension between Purbright and Lawrence lingered in the air. Though Lawrence had retreated into the shadows of the barn, his retreat an almost defeated gesture, Purbright stood still for a moment, watching the man go, but his thoughts were already on what had just transpired. Mrs. Baines's confession, the truth finally coming to light, was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Yet even with the truth now exposed, there was still the matter of what came next. Mrs. Baines had calmed somewhat, though her hands still shook and her eyes remained distant. She hadn't spoken much since she had confirmed Lawrence's accusations, but Purbright could see that the weight of the years was beginning to lift from her shoulders. She had faced it finally after all this time, faced the truth of what she had done and what Lawrence had made her carry with him. "Do you think I'll be able to move past this?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost tentative. She didn't meet, his eyes instead staring down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. Purbright considered the question carefully. He wasn't sure what to say. It wasn't his place to offer her a definitive answer, not yet. But he knew, as always, that time had a way of working its own kind of magic. The truth would set its course, and so would justice. "I think that depends on what you do next," Purbright said at last. "You've already taken the first step, and that's always the hardest one." She nodded slowly, but Purbright could see that. The relief hadn't quite reached her yet. She was still afraid, still haunted by the past she had tried to bury. But in that moment, there was a flicker of something, hope, perhaps, that had been absent when he first arrived. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We'll get through this," Purbright added, his voice softening just a touch, "one step at a time." The words seemed to comfort her, and for the first time she managed a small though weary smile. "Thank you, Inspector," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't think I could have done this without you." Purbright smiled back, though it was a faint and rueful expression. "I didn't do much. You found your courage in the end, that's what matters." There was a long silence between them then, a moment of peace before the storm, before the truth was truly brought to light. And in that silence, Purbright's mind turned over the last few pieces of the puzzle. Lawrence was still a dangerous man, but his control had been broken, and now that his secrets had been exposed, there was no place left for him to hide. The town would know soon enough that the man who had quietly manipulated them all had finally been unmasked. The clock was ticking, and Purbright knew the next step would come quickly. Without another word, he turned to Mrs. Baines. "I'll arrange for the authorities to handle this from here. You've done the right thing. The rest is up to the system now." Her gaze flickered up to meet his, gratitude mixed with lingering fear in her eyes. "What about Lawrence?" Purbright's expression hardened, though his voice remained calm. "Lawrence will face the consequences of his actions. He'll be arrested. There's nothing he can do now." "I never wanted it to go this far," she murmured, almost to herself. "But he kept pushing, kept threatening me. I thought I could keep it all hidden. That maybe it would go away if I stayed quiet long enough." Purbright didn't answer right away. He simply watched her, the quiet understanding passing between them that needed no words. He couldn't imagine the kind of pressure she had been under, the way her life had been shaped by fear and shame. But now, at least, it was over. The truth had been spoken, and the weight of it had begun to loosen its hold on her. As they left the farm and made their way back to the village, the rain continued to fall, a steady, cleansing rhythm that seemed to wash the town clean. Flaxborough was in its way a place of secrets, small, quiet secrets that were hidden just beneath the surface of everyday life. But now, with Lawrence's manipulation exposed and Mrs. Baines free from his grasp, it felt as though the town had taken a deep breath. The darkness that had lingered over it for so long was finally beginning to lift. Purbright, for his part, wasn't sure how much had changed. People would gossip, as they always did, and there would be whispers about the widow and her past. But the truth had come out, and in a town like Flaxborough that was enough. It was always the small victories that counted, the quiet moments when justice was done without fanfare, when the puzzle pieces fell into place at last. As they reached the station, Purbright turned to Mrs. Baines. "You should take some time for yourself," he said. "There's no need to rush. Things will settle down in their own time." She nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Thank you again, Inspector. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." Purbright tipped his hat to her, though his expression was grave. "Just doing my job, Mrs. Baines, but remember, you don't have to do it alone. If you need anything, you know where to find me." With that, he turned and walked back to his office. Leaving Mrs. Baines standing in the rain, looking out at the quiet town that had once seemed so suffocating. But now there was something different in the air, something lighter. Maybe, just maybe, she would find the peace she had been searching for all these years. Purbright stepped inside his office, the familiar hum of paperwork and silence settling around him like an old friend. He took a seat at his desk, pulling out his notebook and beginning the long, tedious process of documenting everything he had learned. There were always more cases to solve, more mysteries to uncover. But for now, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Another case closed, another truth brought to light. As he wrote, the final thought drifted through his mind. There would always be more secrets, more stories to tell in a town like Flaxborough, but sometimes, just sometimes, the right story found its way to the surface, and the truth was finally allowed to breathe.